Since 2020, the US has enjoyed a generally positive growth rate of its gross domestic product, the figure economists use to get a sense of how fast the economy is growing or shrinking. But that streak of good fortune may be about to end. Recently, the Atlanta Fed predicted a negative growth rate for the first quarter of 2025. If true, that means that Americans will have earned less, spent less, and produced less than they did at the end of 2024.
So a lot of good news I'm hearing so far.
If that happens twice in a row, the US will have entered a recession.
The tough thing about giving people financial advice during a recession is that once the recession has begun, it's kinda already too late. As financial advisors, one of our main jobs is to make sure our clients are ready for the
Yeah, I think this is a great point that they're covering. So basically it takes about 6 months for you to officially call a recession in standard terms, which is why there's all these articles and comments and media about being in a recession at various points in time, is because you can only say that you're in a recession after it has happened. And so this is where, when you're leading up to that point, it can feel like a recession is coming, but then you don't technically know for sure at that point in time. So you're kind of looking at these leading indicators of what's going on around you in order for a recession to actually materialize. And people see some of these signs in other ways, like, maybe the job market isn't as good as it used to be, or things are getting expensive and they don't know how to afford it anymore, and the market is maybe going down. These are all the types of things that can signal a recession is happening, but based off of that actual measurement, it does take quite a bit of time for a recession to be officially called. And so there is a good amount of uncertainty as you enter that area. But recessions also have varying lengths, like even in 2020, like we had a market crash and arguably some tough times, but then it started to recover fairly quickly afterwards. Not everything is like the Great Depression and taking like many, many years or multiple years to return back to normal, quote unquote. And so that uncertainty is one of the hardest parts to deal with.
Unexpected curveballs life has a way of throwing at you. An expensive illness, a sudden layoff, a natural disaster, or a recession.
Just a quick look at the historical data will tell you that it's gonna happen sooner or later. Whether that ends up being just a bump in the road or a total financial catastrophe may depend on your level of preparation.
No two recessions are exactly alike, but there are always 3 different ways they can affect your pocketbook. First, your investments. Stocks typically tank during a recession as companies earn less revenue and investors retreat to safer assets like treasury bonds. If you hold financial interest in, say, an IRA or a 401k, that may take a hit, but don't panic. One of the biggest mistakes people make at such times is selling investments that have already lost value. Historically, despite occasional dips, a diversified portfolio will recover with time. The worst thing you can do is to sell it at a guaranteed loss, not to mention eating potential taxes and penalties. In fact, if you're making regular cash contributions to your investments and can afford to continue during a recession, you'll probably be getting shares at a cheaper price.
The second big effect is on prices. Typically, consumer demand falls during recessions, which often results in lower prices. In fact, a combination of low growth and rising prices known as stagflation was once thought to be impossible, until it happened. Again and again in the latter half of the 20th century. Economists say a variety of factors can cause stagflation, including tariffs.
The really scary
It's actually impressive that tariffs made its way into this conversation. It's not surprising. Tariffs are still all the rage. I suspect I'm still going to be talking about tariffs for like maybe 3-6 months or even longer, depending on how long this is going to happen with Trump. But it is clearly a valid point, which is it is an artificial increase in costs. And so that would obviously increase the cost at a particular time, not necessarily related to the other factors that are contributing to the broader market.
thing about stagflation is there's little that can be done to combat it. One of the main tools the government has to influence the economy is raising or lowering interest rates. Turn the knob one way and unemployment comes down, but inflation goes up. Turn it the other way and inflation comes down, but unemployment goes up.
Yeah, this is such an interesting mechanic. They have such a great cartoony way of representing this, but such an actually terrible scenario that exists in reality, because as they're turning this knob, this is actually what the Fed does. And, here it's nice and silly because, this building has eyes on it and these bar charts are moving. But unemployment, that's actual people. That's people like you and I who are not having jobs, who don't have a way of paying for their expenses, maybe not able to support themselves or their family members. And that these things are inherently tied, and that they just shift these incrementally, and they're trying to find a balance of having some people out of jobs so that way there isn't that much money kind of out and about that people are just using to actually combat inflation and other things that are happening. Because if there's less people with jobs, there's less money that those people have, they're buying less things, and then this has an impact to the broader market, and then inflation kind of drops down because there's less supply, there's less demand inherently in it. And so this is such an interesting mechanic that I feel like we talk about a lot and I see in the media quite often, but it's such an inhuman way of describing it, because these are actual people lives that are impacted and their livelihoods that are impacted by some of these decisions.
What if you have both problems at the same time? It's a situation that no country wants to be in. We're not close to a period of stagflation yet, but people are starting to use the word.
The third, and for many main, way a recession can impact your finances is through your employment. Companies scale back and people lose their jobs. Those that remain may see their pay cut or their hours reduced. For people living paycheck to paycheck, this can have devastating consequences. And those just entering the workforce may see long-term negative effects. One study found that young people were more likely to accept a low starting salary during a recession, which hindered their earning potential for decades. So, if you're graduating college or trade school just as the recession's starting, you may want to see if mom and dad will let you crash in the basement for one more year.
The financial pressure that all this creates can put American households in a spot where it's easy to make big mistakes, like, for instance, ignoring debt. It might be tempting when times are tough to put it all on a credit card and deal with it someday down the road. But this can sink you into a hole that will persist long after the recession ends. During periods of stagflation, interest rates may be high, meaning that debt comes at a steep price. And neglecting bills can cause damage to your credit score that may haunt you for years.
Yeah, in general, you should probably... Oh, this is actually great point that I stopped. It looks like she's like sticking her tongue out right now at inflation rates. But you should be cautious on using credit in general. It is one of those things that it's maybe seen as the lesser evil, and you can use it once in a while. And I think there's good usages of debt. I think arguably student loans is a good usage of debt if you are going into the right field and you're getting the right degree. I think getting a home is definitely a good usage of debt. But when you're using these for certain types of expenses, etc., this can be really hard. I know there's some things that, you're probably going to say, if you're in this situation, like what about food and clothing, etc., and this is where these are certainly tough decisions. But if you can't already pay for something in the next month or so, or you don't have a job lined up that you're starting soon, that you can then repay those credit card debt or other debts with, then you're just going to kind of dig yourself into a deeper and deeper hole, and it's going to get harder and harder to get out of. And so if you don't have the means to pay for that item today and you take on debt, it's going to be harder to pay for that item in a month from now, plus the debt that you have. And so it's definitely something that should be taken with caution. There's certainly other ways, like you can look at like food banks or other religious entities like churches or other types of that fashion can sometimes give out food to the less privileged, etc. And so there might be opportunities for you to find resources that can help offset these needs for a very short period of time if necessary, or longer stretches of time. But credit is really bad for you in general, and there's going to be some folks who absolutely can't avoid it, and they're going to have to do that to try to get by for another couple months or whatever timeline that is going to need for them. But I would definitely discourage people from doing it. I feel like it is generally used for minor emergencies sometimes, or maybe people use it not really thinking about it as much, like, oh, I just had my shirt, there's like a hole in it now. I'm going to go immediately buy the nicest, fanciest shirt that I can to replace it. Maybe that's not the best usage of your money. Maybe you can get it repaired. Maybe you can hold off for a week or a month whenever you're going to get paid next, and maybe go to the thrift store or something like that. So there's certainly a lot of options that exist. And so I would definitely discourage anyone from taking on credit card debt, especially in large amounts that they can't currently pay, in order to offset some of their needs. Try to find alternatives. It can take you down a very bad road if you go too far down it.
The best way to avoid the worst effects of a recession is to live every day like you're already prepared for one. And at the top of that prep list is an emergency fund. Having enough readily available cash on hand to float you for 3 to 6 months without income means not having to rack up debt or sell off your retirement investments just to make.
Yeah, I totally agree with this sentiment. I think something I would add on, I know this is a common piece of advice that people give out for financial purposes. And if you're in a situation where you don't have 3 months or 6 months of savings, or you're not that close to it, that can seem like a very large lift. And something that I would say is, you don't have to do this all at once. I think starting to make changes like this are going to be better for you than not. So I'll even go with like a more extreme example. I've known quite a few people who don't have that much money, have been unemployed, have had health issues, a number of problems that are preventing them from being able to make the money that they would like to make and offset the expenses that they have. But I've never met anyone who doesn't have like $1 extra at the end of the month, like $1 that they spent on a lottery ticket, a coffee, random piece of candy or gum at the checkout counter. Everybody at least has $1 that they can find at the end of the month, or I'm sure you could probably find some way to get a side hustle or something like that just to make a single dollar. And in this case, to be a little bit extreme, if you save that dollar every month and you're in a situation where like you don't even have a week's worth of expenses saved, you know, it's going to take you a very long time, but if something really bad happens, you're going to be glad that you have that 10, 20, 30 bucks, whatever it is, extra. And so this is where you don't necessarily need to think of it as like, oh, that's maybe thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars, depending on your expense levels and where you live. Even starting small and just having any amount of savings that you have in case of emergencies will reduce the severity of that emergency, even just by a little bit, and that'll put you just slightly better off. And so I would definitely encourage that for folks right now, especially with some of the uncertainty, to be doing what you can to save, even if you can hit 3 or 6 months.
Ends meet. Because debts and investments both accrue interest, every dollar you keep in an emergency fund could save you at least 2 during a recession.
Another way to prepare is by having a budget. After you've been laid off is about the worst time to try to figure out your expenses and priorities. When times get tough, people with a budget already know how much they need to survive, which debts can be postponed, and which costs can be cut back on. Instead of being caught in a full-blown panic, which no one makes good decisions in, they can make rational, evidence-based adjustments.
And lastly, do your best to eliminate high-interest debt. If, God forbid, you become unable to make monthly payments on a credit card with 20% interest, that can balloon into a monster by the time the recession.
Agreed. And so I think even going back to that example of saving $1, if you already have like a 20%, or I think generally speaking, it's safe to say anything that's like 7% or higher as an interest rate, adding $1 to those debts can also be very useful. And so I would definitely encourage folks to pay those off if they already have them. And I think this is definitely a challenging scenario to be in if this is the current spot that you're in, which is you have a good chunk of debt and you're not really having a lot of extra money to put towards savings, this is a really tough decision. And I think that's something you're going to have to figure out on your own, or maybe seek advice from somebody else that you know that is maybe good at finances, or try to see if you could do some research online. I'm not sure if financial advisors do like pro bono work for folks in this situation, but maybe you can find some like financial literacy or education courses from like your local government or school systems or something like that. But that's a very tough situation of deciding whether you put it towards credit card debt or putting it towards like your bank account or something along those lines. And that's a very tough decision to have to make. So agreed here. If you already have it and you have the means to do so, you should definitely pay that down.
Recession's over. Carrying high interest debt is like carrying around a vibration sensitive bomb that can go off with the slightest bump in the road.
Most people who have these 3 factors in order will be able to weather an average recession and get back on their feet. But what if a recession has caught you off guard without a budget or an emergency fund? The first rule is still don't panic. There are things you can do to soften the blow.
First, make some cutbacks. If you don't have a budget, you might not know where to start, but some of the most obvious discretionary spending is entertainment. Most people can afford to choose between Netflix and Max, at least temporarily. I happen to be a Max girl.
No way, Netflix all the way.
Well, then what do we get rid of?
Peacock. A caveat to that, don't cancel subscriptions that you rely on for work. The point is to get back on your feet, not hibernate. And don't become a hermit. Humans need recreation and society. Instead of dinner and a movie, maybe invite your friends over for board games and boxed wine.
Second, some debts can be postponed in cases of hardship, like student loans, mortgage payments, and even some credit card debt. It's definitely worth a call if it can potentially save you a couple $100 a month. If you have high interest loans that can't be deferred, consider paying them down quickly so the balance doesn't get out of control.
And third, look for help. There are many government programs like unemployment insurance and rental assistance that you may qualify for. Your family, friends, and community can also be of help, perhaps to split expenses or offer you a place to stay until the economy turns around. Swallowing one's pride is far preferable to getting stuck in a decades-long pit of debt.
And lastly, there are lots of free resources for financial guidance and information online, like this.
When things seem grim, it can be tempting to stop thinking about money altogether, but that's the worst thing you can do. Being prepared for a possible recession isn't as hard as you'd think.
And by watching this video, you've already taken the first step.
And that's our 2 cents.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.